Hey everyone, and welcome to the Deep Dive. We're diving into something today that I know a lot of you have been curious about, ketamine for PTSD.
Yeah, seems like everyone's talking about it these days.
It's definitely getting a lot of attention, and for good reason. PTSD is a really serious condition, and we want to approach this topic with a lot of sensitivity. So what we're doing today is we're looking at a recent research paper, and it studied the long-term effects of just a single dose of ketamine for people dealing with PTSD.
Right, and they compared this ketamine group to a control group who received midazolam.
Okay, so a little more background on this study. 27 people total with chronic PTSD, and they were randomly assigned to either the ketamine group or that midazolam group.
Yeah, and here's a key point. Both groups also went through 4 days of trauma-focused therapy right after they got the medication.
So I bet you're wondering, did the ketamine group just see, like, all their symptoms just vanish, like, compared to that other group?
Yeah, were they cured?
Right.
Well, not exactly.
Hmm.
Both groups actually saw a significant improvement in their PTSD symptoms.
Really? So then what's all the excitement about?
Well, the brain activity. That's where things get super interesting. The researchers didn't just stop at measuring those symptoms. They wanted to see what was happening in the brain, specifically in this area called the amygdala.
The amygdala.
The amygdala. You can think of it like the brain's alarm system for fear and those memories tied to trauma.
So even though both groups were saying they were feeling better, the researchers wanted to know, was something different happening in the brains of the folks who got the ketamine?
Exactly. And what they found was really fascinating. A month later, when the participants recalled their traumatic memories, the ketamine group showed way less activity in their amygdala compared to the midazolam group.
So less of an alarm bell going off in their brains.
Yeah, you could say that.
Wow, okay, so less of an alarm bell ringing.
Hmm.
That's pretty interesting. What else did they find out about what ketamine might be doing in the brain?
Well, they also looked at this other area of the brain called the hippocampus, which is like the brain's memory library. And they found something pretty interesting about how the amygdala and the hippocampus were talking to each other in that ketamine group.
Let me guess. They weren't on speaking terms.
Pretty much. The connection between the two, the fear center and the memory center, it just seemed a lot quieter in the ketamine group. It's like, imagine those panicked phone calls between the two were being replaced by calmer, more measured conversations.
Okay, so less shouting. More of a calm discussion. So that could be why those traumatic memories weren't hitting them with the same intensity anymore. Like less communication about the fear.
That's a good way to think about it, but there's one more piece of the puzzle we need to look at. They also investigated the brain's wiring, specifically something called white matter.
Okay, so we've got the amygdala, the alarm system, the hippocampus, the memory library, and now the white matter, the wiring. What's going on with the wiring?
So they focused on a particular pathway in the brain that connects emotions, decision-making, and memory retrieval. And in the ketamine group, they saw a change in how strong and intact this pathway was.
Wait a second, so are we talking about damaged wiring here? That sounds a little scary.
Not necessarily. Think of it like this. Imagine you've got a road that's been paved over and over and over again. It's super smooth and efficient, right?
Yeah, I can picture that.
Now imagine ketamine comes along and it kind of softens up that road a bit. It makes it a little more flexible.
So it's not about damage, it's about making the pathway more adaptable.
Exactly. It's possible that this increased flexibility could actually be a good thing, allowing for some new, healthier connections to form in the brain.
Wow. Okay, so we're talking about potentially rewiring the brain's pathways, especially those related to how we process and react to those traumatic memories.
That's a great way to put it. And, it all points to the amazing ability of brain to change and adapt even in the face of trauma.
This is already blowing my mind, but before we get too far ahead of ourselves, I just want to make sure I'm understanding this correctly. So both the ketamine group and the midazolam group, they showed improvement in their PTSD symptoms. But the brain activity in the ketamine group, it tells a different story.
Precisely. Even though they were feeling better, on the surface, something else was happening underneath in the brains of those who received ketamine.
This feels like we're just scratching the surface here.
Yeah.
What else did they find out about how this rewiring might be working?
That's a great question, and it's exactly where we'll pick up next. We'll delve even deeper into the intricacies of these brain changes and what they could mean for people living with PTSD.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Before we were talking about some pretty fascinating research on ketamine and PTSD and how it might be doing more than just, easing those symptoms. It might actually be changing the way the brain processes trauma.
Yeah, like rewiring those really deep responses to trauma.
Okay, so you mentioned that there's even more to this story. Where do we go from here?
Well, remember how we talked about that specific pathway in the brain? The one that got more flexible in the ketamine group?
Yeah, the superhighway that got a bit softer.
Right. Well, that pathway has actually been studied in other conditions too, like anxiety and depression. And some research has shown that people with PTSD might actually have a super strong, almost overly efficient version of this pathway compared to people without PTSD.
Wait, so having a stronger connection is actually a bad thing in this case? I thought strong connections were supposed to be good for the brain.
Well, it's not that simple. It's kind of like having a superhighway with no exits. The signals, they travel really fast, but they're stuck in this loop, which could explain why people with PTSD often feel trapped in that cycle of fear and anxiety.
So it's not about how strong the pathway is, it's about how flexible it is. Like, could you
Ah.
get off the highway when you need to?
Yeah, that's a great analogy. And that's where ketamine might be playing a role. By making that pathway a little more flexible, it could be allowing for new exits, new ways for the brain to kind of process those memories without getting stuck in that same old fear response.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah,
So less about erasing those memories, more about changing how our brains react to them.
exactly. And it's really important to remember that in this study, the ketamine was given along with that trauma-focused therapy. That combination seems really important.
It's not like you just take ketamine and everything magically disappears.
Eh,
The therapy part helps people actually, process those traumatic experiences in a new way, right?
exactly. The therapy is where you learn how to use those new exits, those new pathways that are opening up in your brain.
This is all happening on like a neurological level, but I think a lot of people listening are probably wondering, what does that actually feel like,
Yeah.
for someone going through this?
That's a great question, and it's something we don't have a perfect answer to yet. This particular study focused on brain activity, not so much on those individual experiences, but there is other research and, anecdotal reports that give us some clues.
So what are people saying? How does it actually feel to have that fear response change?
Well, some people who have received ketamine therapy for PTSD describe feeling a sense of distance from their trauma. Like the memory is still there, but it doesn't have the same grip on them anymore.
It's not that the memory's gone, but it's lost its power.
Exactly. They can think about the memory without being completely overwhelmed by it. It's like finally being able to watch a scary movie without having to hide your eyes.
I can only imagine how freeing that must feel for someone who's been carrying that weight for so long. But this is all still pretty experimental, right?
You're right. Ketamine therapy for PTSD isn't widely available yet, and there's definitely still a lot we need to learn.
So we don't want to give anyone false hope.
Absolutely not. But this research is incredibly exciting because it's showing us that there might be a way to help people not just manage their symptoms, but actually change their relationship with their trauma.
And that's a huge deal for people who feel like their PTSD is, holding them back from living their lives to the fullest.
Exactly. It's about helping people reclaim their lives and their sense of self. And, it all points back to the incredible power of the human brain to heal and adapt.
This is seriously mind-blowing stuff. But we have to remember that this is just one study, and it's really important to talk to a doctor if you're considering ketamine as a treatment option.
Right.
Now, before we wrap up this deep dive, I think there's one more really intriguing detail we need to unpack, and we'll go back to the deep dive. We've been talking about this really interesting research on ketamine and PTSD and how it might actually be working to change how the brain processes these difficult memories.
Yeah, we've been looking at this whole idea of rewiring and creating more flexibility in how those memories are handled.
Right. And before we went to break, you were saying there was one more detail we needed to unpack. Something about how this rewiring might actually be working on like a deeper level.
Well, remember how we were talking about that superhighway in the brain? The one connecting emotions and decisions and memories, and how it seemed to become more flexible in that ketamine group.
Yeah, like ketamine loosened up that really rigid road and gave it more give.
Exactly. Well, that pathway isn't just any random route in the brain. It actually plays a pretty big role in how we regulate our emotions.
Oh, wow. So it's not just about the traumatic memories themselves. It's about how our whole emotional system is reacting to them.
That's right. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Remember how we talked about that superhighway being overly efficient, like almost too rigid in some people with PTSD? What if that rigidity is actually part of what makes it so difficult to process those emotions in a healthy way?
So the emotions are kind of stuck in traffic on that superhighway and they can't find an exit?
Exactly. And that could be why people with PTSD often feel like they're constantly on edge, like they're just bracing for that next emotional impact.
Like they're always on high alert waiting for that alarm bell to go off again.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And what if ketamine is actually helping to create those exits, those off-ramps on that emotional highway?
Hmm. So instead of being stuck in that loop of fear and anxiety, the emotions can kind of flow more freely.
That's the idea. And that could help explain why some people who receive ketamine therapy describe this feeling of calm and detachment from their trauma. It's not that those memories are just gone, but they're not triggering that same level of emotional chaos.
That makes so much sense. It's like they're finally able to see those memories from a safer distance without being completely overwhelmed by them.
Right. And that distance allows them to actually start processing those experiences in a new way without feeling like they're constantly on the verge of a breakdown.
This is really groundbreaking stuff. It's not just about treating the symptoms, it's about changing how people relate to their trauma on such a fundamental level.
And it really highlights that incredible potential of the brain to heal and adapt even after, experiencing something so difficult.
So what does this all mean for people who are, curious about ketamine as a treatment option for PTSD? What's the takeaway here?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that this research is giving us a whole new way of thinking about PTSD and how we treat it. It's not just about, managing those symptoms. It's about changing how the brain processes those memories and the emotions that they trigger.
And it's giving people hope that there might be a way to not just survive PTSD, but to actually thrive in spite of it.
Exactly. It's about reclaiming your life and your sense of self. Of course, it's still early and we need more research, but this is a really promising step in the right direction.
Well, deep divers, that's all for our deep dive into ketamine and PTSD. We hope this has given you some new insights into this potential treatment option and sparked your curiosity about just how amazing the human brain really is. And as always, remember to talk to a healthcare professional for any personalized medical advice. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.